The red clay smelled of iron and rain that morning, the way Tennessee ground always does when it has been opened against its will. Harlan Cobb stood at the fence line with both hands wrapped around a cedar post, watching the engineers load their transit cases into a white pickup. They had been on his pasture for 3 days. They left in 40 minutes. The hole behind them was 40 feet across and still growing. It had appeared overnight, silently, the way karst ground always betrays itself. Not with a crack or a warning, but with a simple, total absence where solid earth had been. One moment the pasture, the next nothing. The engineers declared the site unstable, the void inaccessible, the liability too great to approach. They said it plainly, without apology. Then they drove away down the gravel road, and the dust closed behind them, and Harlan Cobb was alone with the hole and the question no one had bothered to answer. Who was responsible for the hard ground when the engineers refused to touch it? The machine had been sitting at the back edge of Harlan Cobb's equipment shed since 1967, and by the time the engineers left that morning, it had been sitting there for the better part of 26 years. It did not look like a solution to anything. It looked like a problem that had simply stopped moving. The Ruston Bucerus 10RB was a cable boom dragline, built in 1940, and everything about it announced that year without apology. The boom was riveted steel, not welded. Riveted, the way bridges were made before the war. Each joint a small act of faith in compression rather than fusion. The hoist drum sat exposed on the upper frame, wrapped in braided wire cable that Harlan had re-spooled himself in 1974 after the original frayed through on a cypress root in the south drainage ditch. The bucket hung from that cable on a set of chains that had been repaired so many times that no single link in the drag assembly was original anymore. The whole machine ran on a single gasoline engine producing somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 horsepower, which is roughly what a strong farm tractor made in the same era, and which sounds entirely inadequate until you understand what a dragline actually does with that power. It does not push, it does not press, it pulls. The bucket drops by gravity, bites into the material below by its own weight and the angle of the drag chain, and then the drum winds the cable back and the bucket comes toward the machine, scraping the earth as it travels. The operator sits in the cab, in the 10RB's case, a cab that was little more than a steel box with a hinged door and a pair of levers, and controls the whole sequence with cable tension and timing. The machine itself never has to move toward the work. That was the principle Harlan Cobb had spent 26 years understanding, one ditch and one drainage swale at a time. He had bought the 10RB from a man named Earl Pruitt in the spring of 1967 for $800, which was a significant sum for Harlan at the time, representing roughly 6 weeks of what the farm cleared after expenses. Earl Pruitt had used the machine on a series of drainage contracts along the Cumberland River Basin through the late 1950s and early 1960s, and by the time Harlan acquired it, the 10RB had already dug more linear footage of Tennessee ditch than either man could have calculated. It came with 2 buckets, a half-yard and a 3/4 yard, and a wooden crate of spare sheave blocks that Harlan stored in the loft above the shed and never fully inventoried. The work Harlan put the machine to over the following decades was unglamorous and essential. The farm sat in a valley where the water table expressed itself aggressively every wet spring, and the pastures in the low sections would go soft enough to trap cattle if the drainage network wasn't maintained. Harlan ran the 10RB along the field margins every few years, cleaning the ditches that had silted in, cutting new laterals when the old ones failed to carry the load. He learned the machine the way you learn any tool that has no manual, by breaking it in small ways and fixing it, by reading the cable tension through the levers the way a fisherman reads a line, by understanding that the boom angle and the drag speed were a conversation, not a command. By 1993, he could place the bucket within 8 inches of a target from 60 feet away. That reach, 60 feet of working radius from the machine's center pin, was the number that mattered when the engineers drove away. The sinkhole's active edge, the collapsing perimeter where the karst void was still undercutting the surface, was not a place any rubber-tired excavator could approach. The modern machines the engineers would have used, hydraulic excavators, the kind that require firm, load-bearing ground beneath their tracks to develop any working force, needed to be close to the work. They needed to be practically on top of it. And the ground around the void's perimeter was not close to firm. It was a skin of clay over an emptiness that was still enlarging, still consuming its own edges, still deciding how wide it intended to become. The engineers understood this. It was, in fact, precisely why they had declared the site inaccessible. Their equipment required ground contact to function. The void denied them that contact. The logic was clean and the conclusion was reasonable, and it left a 40-foot hole in Harlan Cobb's pasture with no plan attached to it. What the engineers had not accounted for, because there was no reason they would have, was that the machine in Harlan's shed did not need to approach the void at all. The 10RB could set up on solid ground, on the firm pasture 50 feet back from the collapsing edge, on earth that had not been undermined, on ground that had been carrying the weight of cattle and equipment for decades without complaint. And from that position it could reach the active zone entirely through the geometry of its cable and boom. The bucket would travel through the air, not across the compromised surface. The drag chain would pull material back toward the machine without the machine ever committing its weight to the uncertain ground between. The physics that made the dragline useful for swamp drainage, for ditch work in saturated bottomland, for any situation where the operator needed to stay back from the material being moved, those same physics applied here in a way that no piece of modern hydraulic equipment could replicate. Harlan Cobb knew this because he had spent 26 years in the cab of that machine, working ground that did not want to be worked, and he had learned to read the difference between ground that would hold and ground that was lying to him. He walked back from the fence line toward the shed. The 10RB sat in the shadows at the back, the boom folded down along its transport cradle, the bucket resting on the dirt floor with the drag chains coiled on top of it. The machine smelled of old grease and the particular dry metal smell of cable that has been under tension for a long time. Harlan put his hand on the hoist drum and felt the cable wrapped tight against itself, layer on layer, the way it had been since 1974 when he'd re-spooled it himself on a cold February morning with his youngest son holding the tension bar. The engineers had their instruments and their liability assessments and their white pickup truck already a mile down the road. Harlan had this. He did not know yet exactly what the hole would demand of the machine, or how many hours it would take, or whether the karst ground beneath the pasture had finished deciding how far it intended to collapse. That question, the question of what the ground was still hiding, was the one that would take the longest to answer. The smell of Tennessee limestone after rain is something a person does not forget. It rises from the ground like a cold breath, mineral and faintly sweet, the way a cave smells when you press your face to its entrance and the dark air pushes back against you. Harlan Cutter had been breathing that smell his entire life on the 43 acres outside Columbia, in Maury County, and he had learned to read it the way a physician reads a pulse, not for what it told him about the surface, but for what it suggested about everything underneath. What the engineers had not understood, and what no instrument on their clipboard could measure, was that the ground beneath that pasture had been quietly rearranging itself for perhaps 10,000 years. Tennessee sits on one of the most extensive karst formations in the eastern United States. The word karst comes from a Slovenian plateau, but the geology belongs nowhere more completely than to the limestone belt that runs through Maury County like a slow river of stone. Limestone dissolves. That is its fundamental nature. Rainwater absorbs carbon dioxide as it falls through the atmosphere and through the soil, and by the time it reaches the bedrock, it has become a weak carbonic acid, patient and relentless. It finds the joints in the stone, the hairline fractures left behind by ancient pressure, and it widens them. Over centuries, those joints become channels. Over millennia, those channels become rooms. The rooms grow until the ceiling thins, and then one morning a farmer walks out to check on his cattle, and there is a hole in his pasture where there was not one before. The hole on Harlan's property was not a surprise to Harlan. He had watched the ground in that corner of the lower pasture for 3 years before it finally gave way. He had noticed how the rainwater pooled there differently, draining faster than it should, as though the earth beneath were thirsty in a way the rest of the field was not. He had noticed how the cattle avoided that corner even in dry weather, which cattle will do when the ground sounds different under their hooves. Hollow, faintly resonant, a sound that animals register before people think to listen for it. Harlan had listened. He had walked that corner slowly, pressing his boot heel down, feeling for the give that didn't belong. The engineers had not walked it that way. They had driven out from Nashville in a county-contracted vehicle, 2 of them, with soil probe equipment and a standardized assessment form that had been developed for general sinkhole remediation across a range of geological contexts. That form was not wrong exactly. It was simply not specific enough. It asked the right questions for average ground. But karst ground in Maury County is not average ground, and a standardized protocol applied to a non-standard problem produces, with great professional confidence, the wrong answer. In 1940, the USDA Agricultural Census valued Maury County farmland at between $28 and $45 per acre, depending on soil quality and drainage. That range tells a story. The lower end of that range, the $28 land, was almost always the land that sat above the karst. Farmers knew it. They had known it for generations, passed the knowledge down not in written reports, but in the specific warnings a father gives a son when he walks him across a field for the first time. Stay off the low corner in spring. Watch where the water goes. Don't build anything heavy on the limestone flat. The land itself was priced to reflect what it concealed. The engineers' instruments had not been calibrated to that kind of knowledge. What the engineers had missed, and what their unsigned report, still sitting on a desk at the Maury County Planning Office, would never quite admit, was the difference between a sinkhole throat and a sinkhole cavity. The throat is what you see, the opening, the collapsed material, the raw edge of disturbed earth. The cavity is what you don't see, the room below, the void that the throat is merely the entrance to. Loose material, the slumped soil, the broken limestone rubble, the saturated clay that slides down when the ceiling gives way, fills the throat and masks the cavity beneath it. You can look directly into a sinkhole and have no honest idea how deep the true void extends, because the fill material sits in the throat like a cork in a bottle, and the bottle below it may be enormous. The engineers had measured the throat. They had probed to approximately 12 feet and encountered resistance, the resistance of that loose fill, compressed by its own weight. And they had recorded that resistance as a boundary. They had written a number in a box on their form. The number was not dishonest. It was simply the depth of the fill, not the depth of the void, and the form did not have a box for the distinction. There is a reason engineers working under county liability protocols default to the conservative reading. If the report says the cavity extends to 12 feet and remediation is designed for 12 feet, and the cavity later proves to be 30 feet, the liability attaches to the report. The protocol is not designed to find the truth of the ground. It is designed to find a defensible position. Those are not always the same thing, and in karst country they are frequently very different things. Harlan understood this without being able to articulate it in those terms. He had not studied geology. He had not read liability law, but he had watched water. And water in karst country is the most honest instrument available. He had watched how the water that entered the sinkhole throat did not behave like water entering a 12-foot hole. It moved with too much urgency. It disappeared too completely. Water that falls into a contained void fills it and backs up. Water that falls into a connected system, a void linked to channels linked to the deeper karst network, simply vanishes, the way a sound vanishes into a large room, swallowed by the space beyond what you can see. Harlan had stood at the edge of that sinkhole on 4 separate mornings after heavy rain and watched water pour in and not come back. He had dropped a stone and listened for the impact. The first stone, he heard it strike loose material at moderate depth. The second stone, dropped 6 inches to the left of the first, fell for a long moment before it struck anything at all. The difference between those two sounds, between the quick thud and the long silence, was the difference between the throat and the cavity, and it was a difference that no probe driven from the surface could reliably detect. What Harlan read in those two sounds was what the engineers had not stayed long enough to read. The loose material in the throat was bridging the cavity below. It was not a floor, it was a false ceiling, and a false ceiling in karst ground has a habit of announcing its falseness at the worst possible moment, under the worst possible load, in the worst possible weather. The engineers had left because the protocol told them they were done. Harlan stayed because the ground told him it wasn't. He had walked back to the machine shed that afternoon. The shed where the 1940 Ruston Bucyrus 10RB sat with its boom angled toward the roof like a question mark. And he had stood in the doorway for a long time, smelling the grease and the old iron and the faint diesel residue that never fully left the air in that building. He was not a man who made decisions quickly. He had learned that from his father, who had learned it from the land itself, which makes no decision quickly but makes them with a permanence that forecloses argument. The dragline would have to go in, that much was clear. The question was how deep the void actually ran, and whether the machine's reach was sufficient, and whether the ground at the rim was stable enough to hold the weight of 40 tons of 1940 iron positioned close enough to do the work. Those were the questions Harlan carried back to the house that evening. He set them on the kitchen table the way a man sets down a tool he isn't finished with yet, not putting it away, just resting it within reach. The ground beneath the pasture had been deciding how far it intended to collapse for perhaps 10,000 years. It was not going to rush the answer for anyone, but Harlan was going to have to get close enough to ask. The morning Harlan Cutter positioned the Ruston Bucyrus at the rim was cold in the way that late-season Tennessee mornings are cold. Not the hard cold of January, but the damp, insistent cold that settles into iron and makes old machinery speak in ways it doesn't speak in summer. The 10RB's boom cables hummed faintly in the wind off the lower pasture, a low, taut note that Harlan felt in his back teeth before he heard it with his ears. He had been running this machine for 22 years. He knew its sounds the way a man knows the sounds of his own house at night, which creaks are structural and which are just the building breathing. He set the machine 60 feet from the sinkhole rim. That distance was not arbitrary. Harlan had walked the rim the previous afternoon with a long iron rod, pressing it into the ground every 3 feet in a wide arc around the opening, testing for the soft spots that would indicate subsurface erosion extending outward from the visible collapse. The rod sank easily in two places, one at roughly 30 feet from the rim, one at 44 feet. And those soft spots told him that the cast dissolution had migrated laterally beneath the surface, widening the unstable zone beyond what the visible hole suggested. He marked both spots with fence stakes and gave himself a margin beyond the farther one. 60 feet was where the ground answered the rod with solid resistance. 60 feet was where the machine would stand. The boom of the 10RB extended 42 feet. With the dragline bucket on its cable, Harlan could reach the near edge of the sinkhole throat from his position, and with careful angling he could work the bucket across the full diameter of the opening. The geometry was tight, there was no room in it for error, and Harlan did not intend to make any. He lowered the bucket on the first drag at 7:14 in the morning, with the light still low and the frost not yet off the pasture grass. The bucket was a half cubic yard capacity, smaller than the 10RB's rated maximum, which Harlan had deliberately chosen because the throat material was saturated and saturated material is heavier than it looks, and a man who overloads his cable in karst country is a man who has not been paying attention. He let the bucket settle into the throat, felt the cable go slack as it hit the loose fill, and then engaged the drag mechanism and pulled. 1.2 cubic yards of slurry came clear on that first drag. The slurry was grey-brown, a mixture of clay and decomposed limestone and organic material from the pasture surface, and it moved with the thick, reluctant weight of something that had been compressed under its own mass for a long time. Harlan swung the boom and deposited it 20 feet to the east of the hole, in a low area of the pasture he had designated for the spoil pile. Then he swung back and lowered the bucket again. The second drag told him something the first one hadn't. On the second drag, as the bucket settled through the fill material and he began to pull, there was a moment, brief, no more than 2 or 3 seconds, when the cable tension dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the bucket finding a soft pocket in the fill. It was a different kind of drop. Harlan had felt it before, once, years earlier, when he had been working a drainage ditch that crossed a buried culvert nobody had told him about. The cable had gone light in exactly that way when the bucket reached the edge of the culvert and the material in front of it fell away into the open space below. The tension dropped because the resistance dropped, and the resistance dropped because the bucket had found the edge of something hollow. He held the drag. He did not pull through it. He sat in the cab of the 10RB with his hand on the drag clutch and felt the cable, the way a doctor feels a pulse, not measuring it exactly but reading it, letting the information travel up through the steel and the mechanism and the handle and into his palm and from his palm into whatever part of him knew how to interpret it. The void was below the fill was bridging it. The engineer's 12-foot figure was the depth of the bridge, not the depth of the room. Harlan released the drag slowly, let the bucket settle back, and then raised it clear of the hole. He climbed down from the cab, a thing he did not do often once a job was underway, and walked to the rim and looked in. The bucket had disturbed the fill near the center of the throat, and in the disturbed area a small collapse had opened, a dark aperture no wider than a dinner plate, through which a faint cool air was moving. Air moving upward through a sinkhole throat means one thing: there is connected space below, and that space is at a different pressure than the surface, and the pressure is equalizing through the gap. Harlan crouched at the rim and held his hand over the aperture and felt the air against his palm. It was cold. Colder than the morning air. The kind of cold that comes from depth. He stood up and walked back to the machine. For 3 days, Harlan Cutter ran 12-hour shifts on the Ruston Bucyrus, alone on the machine from first light until the light failed. He brought a thermos of coffee and a paper bag with a sandwich, and he did not leave the cab except to walk the rim and read what the disturbed material was telling him. The work was methodical and slow in the way that honest work in difficult ground is always slow. Not because the machine was insufficient, but because the ground demanded to be read at every stage, and reading takes time. By the end of the first day, he had removed approximately 18 cubic yards of fill from the throat, and confirmed that the void below the bridge extended to a depth he could not yet determine. The bucket, on its longest cable run, was reaching 31 feet below the surface of the pasture and still finding loose material rather than competent stone. That meant the cavity was at least 31 feet deep and possibly considerably deeper, and the fill was not a floor, but a column of loose material suspended in a void that had not finished defining its own boundaries. By the end of the second day, the throat had widened to approximately 14 feet in diameter as the unsupported fill at the edges slumped inward. This was expected. Harlan had seen it before. When you remove material from the center of a bridged void, you relieve the lateral pressure that was holding the bridge edges in place, and the edges come down. It is not a failure of the work. It is the work proceeding honestly, the ground revealing what it had been concealing. The hole was getting larger because the hole was getting truthful. Harlan adjusted his drag angle twice on the second day to account for the widened throat, repositioning the boom in 5-degree increments to keep the bucket working the full diameter. The 10RB responded to those adjustments with the deliberate authority of a machine that was built before the age of hydraulics made everything feel effortless. Every movement of the boom required the full engagement of the clutch and brake system, required Harlan's hands and feet working in a coordinated sequence he had drilled into himself over 2 decades until it was no longer thought but reflex. The machine and the man had become a single instrument, and the instrument was reading the ground. On the third day, at 11:40 in the morning, the bucket reached competent limestone at 38 feet. Harlan felt it in the cable before the bucket's resistance confirmed it. A different quality of tension, a firmness that did not give or shift, the solid answer of stone that had not been dissolved, stone that was still doing its structural work. He dragged across it twice to be certain, feeling the bucket skate across the surface of the rock rather than sinking into it, and then he raised the bucket and sat in the cab for a moment with the engine idling and the boom cables humming their low note in the afternoon wind. 38 feet. The engineers had written 12. The difference between those two numbers was the difference between a remediation plan that would hold and one that would fail in the first hard rain of the following spring. It was the difference between fill material compacted against competent stone and fill material compacted against a false floor that would eventually surrender to the void below it. It was the difference in practical terms between the work being finished and the work having to be done again, at greater cost, with greater damage, in worse conditions. The engineer's report, unsigned, still sitting on the county desk in Columbia, had not been written by men who intended to mislead anyone. Harlan understood that. They had followed their protocol. Their protocol had not been designed for what was actually in the ground, and now a farmer with a 1940 dragline and 22 years of cable feel had found the bottom that the protocol had missed. The spoil pile to the east of the hole was substantial now, a low grey-brown mound of slurry and limestone rubble and clay, the extracted evidence of what the karst had been building in secret beneath the pasture. Harlan looked at it from the cab as the engine idled. It was not a dramatic thing to look at. It was just material, removed from where it had been hiding and placed where it could be seen. But the hole was clean now, down to stone. And the next question, the one that had been waiting since the first bucket drag 3 days ago, was what went back in, and how, and in what order, and whether the ground would accept it. The limestone dust arrived before the trucks did. It came on the morning air like chalk and cold mineral, drifting up the county road ahead of Harlan's first load, and Doris caught the smell of it from the porch before she heard the engine. She had grown up near the Louisburg quarry. She knew that smell the way a person knows the smell of a particular kitchen, not just what it was, but what it meant. It meant something was being repaired. It meant the work had moved into its second phase. She set her coffee cup on the railing and did not go back inside. Harlan Dees had arranged the limestone hole 3 days before the dragline ever touched bottom. That was the way he worked. The solution prepared before the problem was fully confirmed, because in his experience, the ground rarely waited for a man to finish thinking. He had driven to the Louisburg quarry himself, spoken to the yard foreman, and ordered crushed limestone in the 3/4-inch gradation, the kind that compacts dense but still allows water to migrate laterally rather than pool, 180 tons of it. The foreman had looked at him over the clipboard and asked if he was building a road. Harlan had said no, he was filling a hole. The foreman had not asked anything further. The first truck rolled onto the property at 7:40 in the morning, its bed heaped with pale grey stone that caught the early light and gave it back in dull flashes. Then a second truck, then a third. They lined up along the fence row like a patient queue, engines idling, while Harlan walked the perimeter of the excavated sinkhole one final time, checking the walls, checking the stone floor the dragline bucket had revealed and cleaned. The hole was approximately 31 feet across at its widest point and had been excavated to a depth of just over 19 feet at center. It looked, in that morning light, like the entrance to something older than the farm. He started at the edge. That was the principle he had settled on, and it was not a complicated one, though it ran contrary to what most men would have done instinctively. Most men, confronted with a hole, want to fill the middle first, want to see the deepest point covered, want the most alarming part addressed immediately. Harlan had watched enough ground move in his life to know that filling the center first was how you built a plug that trapped pressure and moisture beneath it. And pressure and moisture were exactly what had opened the hole in the first place. He would fill from the perimeter inward. He would let each ring of stone settle and compact before the next ring was placed. He would work toward the center the way a wound closes, from the outside in, the edges drawing together slowly, the core the last thing to seal. The dragline made this possible in a way no other machine on the property could have. Its reach, that long cable-suspended boom that had been engineered in 1940 for exactly this kind of extended, precise placement, allowed Harlan to set limestone from the truck beds into the hole's perimeter without ever positioning the machine over unstable ground. He stood the dragline back on firm soil, on the undisturbed pasture where the compaction test of the previous 2 days had confirmed the substrate was sound, and he swung the bucket out over the void and placed stone the way a mason places mortar, deliberately, in measured amounts, reading the way each load settled before committing the next. The bucket dragged back across the new fill, and the weight of it served as the first compaction pass. On the third day of filling, Harlan's neighbor Calvin Prater arrived with a Caterpillar D4 dozer, a machine that Calvin had bought used in 1959 and maintained with the same unhurried stubbornness he applied to everything he owned. Calvin was a lean man with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone Harlan was pouring into the ground, and he said very little when he arrived, just backed the D4 off his trailer, walked the fill perimeter once with his hands in his pockets, and climbed up onto the machine. He and Harlan had not discussed payment. That was not how things worked between them. Calvin ran the dozer over the compacted perimeter fill in overlapping passes, the machine's weight pressing the stone down into itself, closing the air gaps, knitting the gradations together into something that would bear load. The drainage question had been settled the morning before Calvin arrived. Harlan had spent a long time on that question, longer than on any other single element of the repair, because he understood. In the way a man understands something he has never formally studied but has watched play out across decades of land, that water was the original architect of the whole, and that water would be the first thing to test whatever he built in its place. The county drainage maps from 1942 showed the subsurface flow direction in that part of the pasture. He had pulled those maps from the county office himself, had spread them on the kitchen table under the hanging lamp, and had traced the old logic with his finger. The engineers who had drawn those maps had understood something that the engineers who had written the recent report apparently had not found time to revisit, that in karst terrain, the correct drainage strategy was not to redirect water aggressively, but to let it find its own exit first. Impede it, and it finds another way down. Channel it gently, and it moves through without accumulating pressure. Harlan had cut a shallow swale on the uphill side of the repair, angled to carry surface water around the fill zone rather than across it, and had packed the swale's bed with the same crushed limestone so that infiltration, when it happened, would happen slowly and evenly. Day 5, the fill reached grade. Day 6, Harlan walked the surface of it in the early morning, pressing his boot heel into the stone at intervals, reading the give or the lack of it, the way a doctor reads a pulse. There was almost no give. The fill had knit. Calvin's compaction passes had done what they were supposed to do, and the limestone's own angular geometry, the way crushed stone locks face to face rather than rolling against itself like rounded gravel, had done the rest. The surface was not soft. It was not hollow-sounding when he struck it with a steel rod. It did not yield. Day 7, the ground stopped moving. That was how Harlan described it afterward, in the plain declarative way he described most things. Not that the repair was complete, not that the sinkhole had been filled, but that the ground stopped moving, because that was the actual verdict. The ground had been moving, invisibly for years before the surface gave way, and it had been moving in a more visible and alarming way for the 6 days of the repair, settling incrementally with each compaction pass, finding its new geometry. And then, on the morning of the 7th day, Harlan walked the fill zone and found nothing new. No fresh settlement, no cracking at the perimeter edges, no change in the grade stakes he had driven at the 4 compass points of the repair. The fill had accepted the load and held it. Doris brought coffee out to where he was standing at the edge of the fill zone, and he took the cup without looking away from the ground. The limestone surface had already begun to grey down from its fresh pale color, dulling toward the tone of the surrounding pasture soil. In another season, it would be invisible. In 2 seasons, grass would cover it. The hole that had swallowed a fence post and a section of the county's confidence would become, in time, indistinguishable from the land around it. The dragline stood at the field's edge, its boom lowered, its bucket resting on the ground. It had not moved since the last fill placement 2 days before. It looked, in the flat morning light, like an animal that had finished its work and was waiting to be told what came next. What came next was a question that had nothing to do with the ground. The county engineer came out on a Tuesday, measured the stabilized fill with a rod and a level, wrote something in his notebook, and left without saying a word to Harlan. The repair that the engineer's report had valued at $14,000 had been completed by a machine that cost $800 in 1940, operated by a man who had never filed a single credential. The dragline sat at the pasture's edge, its cable slack, its bucket resting in the grass that was already beginning to creep back across the limestone fill, and the cattle had returned to that corner of the field as though nothing had ever interrupted them. The land did not care who signed the report. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of quiet men, hard ground, and the machines that outlasted the paperwork. There are dozens of these histories still buried, in pastures, in county records, in the memories of men who never wrote a single word down.